There are structures sitting on the edge of the Egyptian desert that have been staring back at humanity for 4,500 years. You've seen the photographs. You know the shape. 3 triangles rising out of pale sand. So enormous they feel less like buildings and something more like geological events. The Great Pyramids of Giza. And yet, for all that familiarity, there's a question underneath them that most people have never fully sat with. Not who built the pyramids exactly, because that question actually has a pretty solid answer. But what built even means when you're talking about something this scale. Think about it for a moment. When we ask who built the pyramids, we might mean who designed them, who worked out the geometry, the angles, the internal chambers, the weight distribution of millions of stone blocks stacked into a near-perfect point. We might mean who physically cut the stone, who dragged it, who hauled it upward and set it into place under the Egyptian sun. We might mean who organized all of that, who managed the supply chains, the food, the tools, the tens of thousands of human beings who had to show up every day and somehow function as a single coordinated machine. Or we might mean who had the authority to make any of it happen in the first place, whose name was on the order, whose idea it was to move a small mountain of limestone onto the desert plateau west of the Nile. All of those questions have different answers, and together they make this one of the most layered historical puzzles that archaeology has ever tried to untangle. We're going to focus mostly on Giza, the 3 pyramids you know best, the ones built for the pharaohs Khufu, Khafre and Menkaure during the 4th dynasty of the Old Kingdom, roughly 2560 to 2510 BCE. But Giza didn't appear out of nowhere. It was the result of almost a century of earlier experiments, earlier pharaohs trying things out, getting them wrong, adjusting, and handing what they'd learned to the next generation. Those earlier pyramids are part of this story too, because they show us that the Great Pyramid wasn't a miracle dropped from the sky. It was the product of accumulated knowledge, trial and error, and a civilization that was genuinely figuring things out in real time. And the evidence we have for all of this is richer than most people realize. There are ancient texts, some carved directly into stone, some written on papyrus, that name the people involved and describe the work being done. There are tool marks on quarry walls that preserve the exact motion of a hand that died 4,000 years ago. There are settlements, actual towns, where the workers lived and ate and got medical treatment. Towns that have been excavated within the last few decades and completely changed what we thought we knew. There are graffiti tags left by the work gangs themselves, little scrawled names of crews who wanted the world to know they were there. When you lay all of that evidence out, the picture that emerges is not mysterious at all. It's deeply, startlingly human. That's what makes this story worth spending time with. Because the pyramids aren't just impressive engineering. They're a record of what human beings are capable of when they're organized, motivated, and given enough time. They tell us something about the ancient Egyptians, but they also tell us something about us, about what it looks like when a civilization decides something is worth doing badly enough to actually do it. Now, there are also theories you've probably come across. Theories involving lost civilizations, alien architects, technologies we've somehow forgotten how to use. We'll get to those, we'll give them a fair look, but we're going to work our way through the evidence first, because the real story, it turns out, is a lot more interesting than any of the alternatives. The people who built these things were extraordinary without needing to be anything other than human. If you're listening to this right now in the dark, getting comfortable, letting the day soften at the edges, that's exactly what this is for. The pace is slow, there's no rush. We're going to move through this the same way the Nile moves, steadily, carrying things forward. From myth into evidence, from mystery into something you can actually hold. By the time we're done, you'll have a clearer sense of who these people were, how they worked, what they ate, what they believed, and why they spent their lives building something that would outlast every single thing else their civilization ever made. Before we go further, though, I want to know where you are right now. Are you in a quiet bedroom somewhere in Europe, the window cracked, the city outside gone soft and still? Maybe you're in North America, somewhere between the end of the day and the beginning of sleep. Maybe it's early morning somewhere in Asia or Australia, and you're letting this ease you into waking slowly. Drop it in the comments. The city, the time, whatever you feel like sharing. I read them, and there's something genuinely remarkable about seeing all of those places stack up. All of those different midnights and quiet mornings, all connected by the same question carved in stone. 4,500 years ago, someone decided to do something that had never been done before. Something that required more coordination, more labour, more planning, and more sheer sustained human will than anything that had come before it in recorded history. And they pulled it off, 3 times, on the same plateau, in the span of roughly 3 generations. The question is how, and the answer starts long before the first stone was ever cut. To understand the pyramids, you have to understand what Egypt had become by the time anyone thought to build them. Because the Great Pyramid of Khufu, that 4.5 million ton stack of precision-cut limestone sitting on the Giza plateau, that wasn't the product of inspiration. It was the product of a system, and building that system took centuries. Let's go back, way back, before the Old Kingdom, before dynasties, before pharaohs. Around 5000 BCE, the Nile Valley was home to scattered agricultural communities, villages of people who had figured out something important. The river flooded every year reliably, depositing a thin layer of extraordinarily fertile silt across the land on either side of its banks. You planted into that silt and things grew, not just adequately, abundantly. The Nile wasn't like other rivers. It was a food engine, and the people living along it were starting to understand just how powerful that engine could be. Here's what that meant in practical terms. When your land is so fertile that a relatively small number of farmers can feed far more people than are actually farming, you end up with something historically rare and transformative. You end up with surplus. Food you don't immediately need. And surplus, almost universally throughout human history, does the same thing. It creates hierarchy, because someone has to manage the surplus, store it, distribute it, protect it. Someone has to keep records. Someone has to coordinate the planting, the harvesting, the irrigation. And whoever does that work accumulates power. Over centuries, those centres of management and coordination consolidated. Small chiefdoms became larger ones. Trade networks pulled communities together. And sometime around 3100 BCE, in one of the most consequential political events in the ancient world, Upper and Lower Egypt unified under a single ruler. That unification didn't just create a country. It created a machine. A centralized state with the administrative capacity to extract resources from an entire river valley and direct them toward a single purpose. And within a few centuries, that machine was going to be aimed at the sky. The early dynastic period, roughly 3100 to 2686 BCE, was the warm-up act. Pharaohs were consolidating power, establishing institutions, figuring out how to actually govern something as long and thin and geographically peculiar as Egypt. The country runs for about 800 miles along the Nile, narrow as a thread for most of its length, hemmed in by desert on both sides. Holding that together administratively, making sure grain collected in the south actually gets distributed efficiently. Making sure construction materials quarried in one region can be moved to another. All of that required invention. Egypt essentially had to invent the bureaucratic state from scratch. And they did. By the time the Old Kingdom begins, around 2686 BCE, they had built something genuinely remarkable. At the top was the pharaoh, who was not merely a king in the political sense. The pharaoh was a divine figure, understood to be the embodiment of Horus, the falcon god, and upon death, to merge with Osiris, god of the dead and the afterlife. This wasn't just ideology for public consumption. It was the organizing principle of the entire civilization. The pharaoh sat at the intersection of the human and divine worlds. His job was to maintain ma'at, a concept that doesn't translate cleanly into English, but means something like cosmic order, balance, justice, the right relationship between all things. If the pharaoh maintained ma'at, the Nile would flood, the crops would grow, the sun would rise, and the world would keep working. If he failed, chaos would enter. That was the deal. Not a metaphor, reality, as they understood it, which means tomb building wasn't an act of vanity. It was cosmically necessary. The pharaoh's safe passage through death and into the afterlife was required for the maintenance of Mat itself. A properly equipped, properly constructed tomb wasn't a luxury. It was a piece of infrastructure as essential as any irrigation canal. Building it correctly, building it durably, building it in a way that would last through eternity. That was a religious obligation with consequences for every living person in Egypt. When you hold that belief genuinely and completely, and they did, the decision to devote extraordinary national resources to tomb construction isn't strange at all. It's obvious. Below the pharaoh, the state had developed a sophisticated hierarchy of administration. The vizier sat at the top of that hierarchy, a kind of prime minister and chief judge combined, the person who actually managed the day-to-day operations of the kingdom, while the pharaoh occupied a more elevated symbolic role. The vizier oversaw the granaries, the courts, the construction projects, the tax records, the labour allocation. During the 4th dynasty, when the Giza pyramids were being built, the vizier's office was one of the most powerful positions in the ancient world. Beneath the vizier, a vast network of scribes kept the whole enterprise running. The scribes are easy to underestimate, because we tend to think of writing as passive, as record-keeping, as the thing that happens after the real work is done. But in Egypt, the scribes were the infrastructure. They tracked grain production by village, by field, by season. They recorded which workers had completed their labour obligations and which hadn't. They managed inventories of copper tools, of rope, of wooden sledges, of rations. They processed the flow of resources from the provinces into the capital and back out again to wherever they were needed. Without the scribes, the pyramids don't get built. Not because they wielded tools, but because the entire logistical operation that made tool work possible depended entirely on their records. The provinces themselves, called nomes, each had their own governors and local administrators who fed resources and labour upward into the central system. Egypt wasn't just centrally controlled from a single point. It was a network with information and resources flowing both ways. Provinces sending up grain and workers and raw materials, the central administration sending back tools, food, skilled craftspeople, and occasionally the pharaoh's own architects. And then there was labour. One of the key institutions that made large-scale building possible was what's sometimes called corvée labour, a system of obligatory state service. Egyptian farmers weren't working 12 months a year, for roughly 3 months every year, when the Nile was flooding and the fields were underwater, and planting was impossible anyway. Agricultural workers had nothing to do. The state organised that idle time. You came, you worked on state projects, you were fed, housed, and given medical care. Your labour was your tax. In exchange, you were part of something, part of the national project, the pharaoh's divine mission, the maintenance of Ma'at itself. Whether workers experienced this as an honour or a burden, or some complicated mixture of both, we genuinely don't know. Probably it varied by person and circumstance, the way it does with most obligatory civic duties throughout history. Now the pyramids proper began not at Giza, but at Saqqara, around 2650 BCE, with a pharaoh named Djoser, and an architect whose name has survived 4,500 years, Imhotep. We'll come back to him. Djoser's tomb was originally conceived as a mastaba, a flat-topped rectangular mud brick structure. that had been the standard royal tomb for generations. The word mastaba is Arabic for bench, because that's roughly what they looked like from a distance. Then someone, and the evidence strongly suggests it was Imhotep, had an idea. Stack one mastaba on top of another, then another on top of that, then another. The result was the Step Pyramid of Saqqara, the world's first large-scale stone structure, rising in 6 unequal tiers to a height of around 60 meters. It was unprecedented. There was nothing else like it in the world. But it was just the beginning of a learning curve that would run for almost a century before Giza. After Djoser came a series of increasingly ambitious attempts to build true pyramids with smooth angled sides. Some of them failed dramatically and visibly. The bent pyramid at Dashur started at one angle, then shifted partway up to a shallower one, almost certainly because the engineers realised mid-construction that their original slope was too steep for the structure to hold. The Red Pyramid built by Khufu's father Sneferu was the first successfully completed true pyramid, a genuine proof of concept that the geometry could work at scale. Sneferu may have built more pyramid volume than any other pharaoh in history, not because he was more powerful than Khufu, but because he was doing more of the experimental work. By the time Khufu inherited the throne, Egypt had been practicing, refining and correcting for nearly 100 years. The administrative systems were in place. The labour systems were in place. The quarrying and transport techniques had been tested. The mathematics and geometry of pyramid construction had been worked out through actual physical failure and correction. What looks from the outside like an impossible feat of sudden genius was, from the inside, the endpoint of a long process of state-building and engineering development. We know this not because we have a complete record. We absolutely don't. Large portions of Egyptian administrative life from this period are simply gone, papyrus decayed, stone reused, knowledge lost to time. What we have are fragments, some remarkable and detailed, others maddeningly incomplete. The evidence is enough to build a picture, but it has genuine gaps, and the honest version of this history keeps those gaps in view. What we can say with confidence is this. By the time the 4th dynasty arrived, Egypt had built something more powerful than any monument. It had built the capacity to build, and the pharaoh who would push that capacity to its absolute limit was about to take the throne. If you walked through an Egyptian cemetery a century before Khufu, you wouldn't see clean 4-sided pyramids stabbing into the sky. You'd see low, sloping rectangles, mastabas, modest, heavy, almost blunt. A mastaba was a kind of architectural sentence that Egypt kept repeating with small variations. Rectangular base, sloping sides, flat top, built first in mud brick, later in stone. Below ground, a vertical shaft leading down to the burial chamber. Above ground, a chapel where offerings could be made, where the living could keep talking to the dead. It worked. It did the job. The king was buried, the rituals were performed, Mart was maintained. For generations, nobody felt an urgent need to reinvent the basic shape of the royal tomb. Then Djoser and Imhotep changed the conversation. The Step Pyramid at Saqqara is often treated like a sudden leap, a gigantic aha moment where an ancient genius appeared and the first pyramid rose neatly into the sky. But if you look closely at how it was built, what you see is not one miraculous idea, but a series of revisions. Djoser's tomb complex seems to have started life as a perfectly ordinary mastaba, planned according to standard practice. Then it was enlarged, then enlarged again. The plan changes several times. At some point in that process, the idea emerges, instead of just expanding one low rectangle, what if we put another one on top, and then another, and another? What you end up with is a mastaba that has been iterated vertically, a stack of benches, each layer slightly smaller than the one beneath, climbing in a series of giant steps to a height that must have been astonishing to people used to single-story buildings. The step pyramid is innovation, yes, but it's innovation that you can actually see evolving in stone. No hidden tech, no lost blueprints, just a familiar form, pushed, stretched, and reimagined. And as soon as you start stacking stone at that scale, new problems appear. How steep can the sides be without the whole thing slumping outward and collapsing? How do you bond the outer layers to the inner core so the faces don't peel away? How do you build internal chambers and passages inside a structure that heavy without accidentally creating fault lines that will bring the whole thing down? The step pyramid doesn't answer all of those questions. It's still terraced, not smooth, but it forces Egyptian architects to begin thinking like structural engineers in a way they hadn't needed to before. And the state, eager to secure the pharaoh's afterlife and its own legitimacy, is willing to fund those experiments on a monumental scale. After Djoser, other kings follow, and the forms keep shifting. Mastabas are still built, especially for high officials, but royal tombs are moving in a clear direction, taller, more massive, more geometrically pure. At Midum, that shift becomes almost painfully visible. Midum starts, as far as we can tell, as a step pyramid. Then the builders wrap it in a smooth outer shell, trying to turn a terraced structure into a true pyramid with continuous flat faces. On paper, it's a clean solution. In reality, it's less successful. The outer casing and parts of the core eventually collapse, probably in antiquity. What's left today is a strange tower surrounded by a heap of rubble, like a geometry problem that has exploded. For some people, that ruin looks like mystery. For an engineer, it looks like a failed prototype. Because that collapse tells you something very simple and very important. They didn't know everything in advance. They were not magicians following a set of perfect instructions handed down from some unknown source. They were builders discovering limitations by hitting them, sometimes catastrophically. The same story plays out at Dashur in a slightly different way. Look at the bent pyramid. It rises from the desert at a steep angle and then, halfway up, changes its mind. The slope breaks, becoming much shallower, giving the whole structure that kinked, bent appearance that gives it its modern name. There are several theories about exactly why this happened. Maybe the ground beneath wasn't stable enough. Maybe they saw early cracking in the casing stones. Maybe the angle was simply too aggressive for the height they intended to reach. Whatever the precise reason, the change in slope is an admission carved into 100 meters of limestone. Something about the original plan wasn't going to work. You don't change the angle on a royal tomb because you're bored. You change it because reality is forcing you to. The builders adjusted in real time, preserving the monument by accepting a compromise in its perfect geometric form. That bend is learning frozen in stone. Those experiments belong mostly to one man's reign, Sneferu, Khufu's father. Sneferu's building program is immense. Midum, the bent pyramid, and the red pyramid at Dashur are all associated with him. If you add up the volume of stone he ordered, moved and stacked, it may exceed that of any other pharaoh. But Sneferu isn't just the guy who liked pyramids. His reign looks, from an architectural point of view, like a prolonged research and development phase. At Midum, you see them experimenting with converting stepped forms into smooth ones. At Dashur, with the bent pyramid, you see them discovering safe angles and structural limits. And then, a short walk away, you see the payoff, the red pyramid. The red pyramid is the first successfully completed large-scale true pyramid in Egypt. Its faces rise at a consistent, relatively shallow angle. The internal chambers are higher up in the structure than before, accessed by a long descending passage. The stonework shows standardized techniques that will later be refined at Giza, blocks laid in horizontal courses, corners carefully bonded, casing stones cut with tight, sloping joints to shed water and lock into place. Sneferu's architects seem to have settled on a set of key design principles: a safe angle of about 43 degrees, internal spaces placed where the load paths are predictable, and a sheathing of fine limestone casing that both protects the rougher core and gives the monument its radiant, smooth surface. These are not theoretical principles. They're conclusions drawn from very expensive trial and error. Every time a casing collapsed, every time cracks appeared, every time a passage sagged under the weight of the stone above it, those failures became data. Adjust the slope, change the orientation of the blocks. Reinforce with relieving chambers above the main rooms so the weight is distributed to the sides instead of bearing straight down. When you walk through the corbelled ceilings and oddly angled stress-relieving spaces inside later pyramids, you're seeing an ancient solution to a very practical problem. How do you put empty space inside a mountain of rock without letting gravity win? By the end of Sneferu's reign, Egypt had answers that worked. They knew empirically what angles were safe. They had a repertoire of internal chamber layouts. They had standard dimensions for blocks, techniques for fitting casing stones so precisely that some joints are hard to even see today. They had organized quarrying on a massive scale, with teams cutting and dressing limestone in standardized shapes. They had learned to align structures to the cardinal points with surprising accuracy, likely using the circumpolar stars and simple sighting tools. All of that means that when Khufu comes to the throne, he isn't standing at the edge of a dark unknown. He's inheriting a tested template and a state apparatus that has already proven it can move and place millions of tons of stone. What he does at Giza is not invent the pyramid from nothing. He takes the Sneferu-era system and pushes it to its logical extreme. A carefully chosen plateau with solid bedrock. A well-established safe angle, slightly steeper than the Red Pyramid, but still within what experience suggests is possible. Internal chambers stacked in a vertical sequence, buffered by relieving spaces, and built from enormous granite blocks for strength. Casing stones cut with even greater precision, polished to reflect the sun, so that the whole structure becomes, in effect, an artificial mountain of light. From a distance of 4,500 years, Khufu's pyramid can look like a miracle, a singular anomaly dropped into history. But when you line up the mastabas, the step pyramid, Midam, Dashur, and then Giza, the miracle starts to look a lot like a curve. Slow experimentation, visible mistakes, incremental improvements. A state that keeps throwing its full weight behind each attempt, because the stakes are cosmic and the lessons are enduring. Khufu's monument is the climax of that trajectory, not an isolated mystery, but the most ambitious chapter in a story Egypt had been writing in stone for generations. And behind that stone, behind every angle and passage and polished casing block, someone had to decide what to build, where to place it, and how far to push what the system could handle. When we talk about Khufu's pyramid, it's tempting to picture one mind at work. A single mastermind king standing on the plateau, pointing dramatically and declaring, "Build it there." Reality was probably quieter and far more complicated. Khufu, as far as we can tell, is the patron, not the project manager. In Old Kingdom ideology, the king is the axis between Earth and the gods. His body, his tomb, his cult, those are matters of cosmic order. Mat itself depends on his proper burial and eternal maintenance. So in a sense, yes, the pyramid is his doing. The decision to build on that scale in that place during his reign sits at the very top. But the moment the idea becomes a project, an entire hierarchy comes into focus beneath him. We know some of their names. They're carved into tomb walls and statues and offering tables scattered around Giza and other sites. Titles wrapped around them like job descriptions from a 4,500-year-old bureaucracy. There's Hemiunu, for instance, often identified as a key figure in Khufu's reign. His mastaba at Giza is huge, close to the Great Pyramid, and the titles on his statue are revealing: Overseer of all construction projects of the king, vizier, king's son in the broader sense of high-ranking royal relative. If anyone sat in the central office with the big papyrus plans, it might have been him. Then there are men like Ankaf, possibly Khufu's half-brother, bearing titles such as overseer of all works of the king under Khafre. Others are called overseer of the pyramid town, overseer of the scribes of the granaries, overseer of quarrying, chief of the king's scribes. Each phrase is a little window into how the machine functions. Overseer of the king's works suggests someone tasked with turning royal wishes into actual stone on the ground. Overseer of quarrying implies a person responsible for the cutting, sizing and shipment of blocks. Overseer of the pyramid town hints at someone coordinating housing, food, water, tools, logistics that would swallow an unorganized state whole. The pharaoh in this system doesn't personally decide where every ramp goes or which limestone layer to tap on the plateau. He authorizes a monument of unprecedented ambition, appoints trusted kin and officials to oversee it, and then the pyramid becomes a test not just of stone and geometry, but of the administrative state. And that state, by Khufu's time, has been practicing. Large-scale building under Djoser and Sneferu has already required some form of centralized planning. You don't experiment with multiple massive pyramids in one reign without a mechanism for saying, this many workers, this much grain, these many donkeys and boats, this stretch of quarry cliff to be cut this year. That kind of coordination leaves fingerprints. One of those fingerprints is the way labour seems to have been scheduled. Egypt's agricultural cycle runs on the Nile flood. When the river rises, fields disappear underwater. You can't plough or harvest, but you can move heavy things on boats, because the river widens and becomes a highway. You can also take farmers who are temporarily unneeded in the fields and employ them elsewhere. Many Egyptologists think major building projects tapped into exactly this rhythm. The state would draft corvée labour, temporary rotating service, from villages up and down the Nile. Men who spent most of the year farming might spend a season hauling blocks, cutting stone chips, or delivering supplies. Then they'd go home, replaced by the next wave. This doesn't look like a single unbroken army of slaves suffering year-round. It looks more like an enormous, carefully timed borrowing of human effort, coordinated with the flood, the harvest, and the storage of grain. To do that on a scale that feeds tens of thousands of mouths around Giza, someone has to be tracking who is coming from where, who is exempt, who is overdue, and how much bread and beer will be waiting when they arrive. That's where scribes and administrators step in. We find them in the titles: scribe of the king's document, scribe of the granary of the pyramid, inspector of the royal estate. Their job is information. Lists, tallies, rosters, how much stone moved this month, how many oxen died, which village has fulfilled its corvée quota. In a world without spreadsheets, a line of numbers on a papyrus roll is how the king's will physically becomes a 6 million ton structure. And then, below the high officials and the scribes, you start seeing the teams. In the relieving chambers above Khufu's burial chamber, the hidden, narrow spaces that nobody was meant to see, we find ancient graffiti. Red-painted, informal, not for ritual display. Crew names and marks like the Friends of Khufu Gang, the Drunkards of Menkaure, the Quarters of the Boat Gang. At Deir el-Bahri and in the workmen's village of Deir el-Medina, centuries later we see similar patterns. Work organised into crews, gangs and sub-teams with their own names, rivalries and pride. It's reasonable to think something like that already existed at Giza. A pyramid is too big to be built by an amorphous mass. You break the task into units: a gang for this side, a team for casing stones, another for ramps, others for fetching water and fuel and tools. Team and gang here are not modern corporate buzzwords. They're ancient organisational cells, each with a foreman, maybe an assistant, maybe its own scribe. Orders don't trickle down from Khufu directly. They cascade, from king to vizier, from vizier to overseers of works, from them to regional officials and gang leaders, from them to the men actually hauling the sledges. How tight was the control from the top? That part is harder to see. Some scholars imagine a very centralized system, with detailed plans conceived in the court and implemented step by step. Others suggest a looser arrangement, where the central authority sets the overall target, the size, the orientation, the completion within a reign, but leaves local managers to solve problems on the ground. The archaeological record offers hints, but not blueprints. The standardization of blocks and the consistency of the layout suggests a strong guiding template. You don't get that kind of regularity if every quarry foreman is improvising. On the other hand, the adjustments we see, the fine-tuning of chamber positions, subtle shifts in course thickness, possible changes in internal design as the pyramid rose, hint that decisions were being made midstream, likely by people on site, not in the palace. It may have worked something like this. The central administration decides the monument's broad parameters and supplies the manpower and resources. Within that framework, local overseers, architects, and master builders adapt to the rock, the weather, the pace, and the mistakes they discover along the way. Orders from the top, solutions from the middle. So when you stand at the base of Khufu's pyramid in your mind and you ask, who gave the orders? You can imagine several layers answering at once. Khufu, whose name the whole mountain is meant to sustain forever. Hemiunu and other high officials, translating royal desire into measurable quotas and schedules. Scribes counting heads and loaves. Overseers at the quarries, matching hammer blows to deadlines. Gang leaders shouting to pull in unison. And beneath all of that, an administrative culture that had grown up over generations of building, learning how to turn agricultural surplus into architecture. The next question, of course, is who these workers actually were, and what their lives looked like when they weren't just names in a bureaucratic chain of command. For that, we have to step away from the throne room and walk down toward the workers' town. If you grew up with Hollywood epics or old textbooks, you might already have a picture in your head, lines of beaten slaves, whipped up ramps under the blazing sun, dying nameless for a tyrant's tomb. That image is powerful. It's also not what the ground at Giza is telling us. The ancient Egyptians did know slavery. By the New Kingdom, prisoners of war and foreign captives are clearly attested as bound labour in various roles. But for the Old Kingdom, at the time of Khufu, the evidence is thinner, and when we look specifically at the Giza Plateau, the story that emerges is not a simple slave camp. We don't have a detailed written account from an eyewitness saying, here is exactly who built Khufu's pyramid and how they were treated. What we do have are burials, settlement ruins, tool marks, inscriptions, and the quiet testimony of bones. Near the pyramids, archaeologists have uncovered cemeteries for workers. Simple graves compared to royal tombs, but not anonymous pits. Bodies are laid out carefully, sometimes with modest offerings. The skeletons show signs of heavy labour, spine compression, fractures, worn joints, but they also show medical care. Broken bones that were set and healed. People who were injured then lived on. That doesn't fit an image of utterly disposable slaves. Then there's the town itself. South of the pyramids, excavations have revealed the remains of a planned settlement, often called the Workers' Town or Hayt el Ghurab. Rectangular barrack-style buildings, long galleries that could have housed rotating crews, storage rooms, administrative areas, and clustered nearby industrial-scale facilities, bakeries and breweries. Not little domestic ovens and a single beer jar per household, but lines of bread moulds, huge vats, installations designed to produce enormous quantities of standard rations. Bread and beer, the basic pay packet of an Egyptian labourer. The picture that takes shape is one of organised state-supported labour, people fed, housed and overseen while they did their stint at the king's works. How did those people end up there? One key piece is something already mentioned: corvée duty. Many pre-modern states used this system. Instead of, or in addition to, paying taxes in grain or goods, communities owed a certain amount of labour each year. Men were drafted for a season and sent where the state needed them, digging canals, repairing dikes, hauling stone for temples and tombs. In Egypt, the Nile's cycle made this especially convenient. When the fields were under water, farmers couldn't farm, but they could work for the state. So corvée labourers from villages up and down the river were likely rotated through projects like the Giza pyramids. They slept in barracks or tents, received rations from the royal granaries, did their months of duty, and then went home, replaced by the next group. These were not free agents in the modern sense. Refusing the king's corvée was not really an option. But neither were they chattel who could be bought and sold individually. They were more like conscripted taxpayers in a system where paying often meant giving your time and your body. Alongside them, there seemed to have been more permanent crews. The consistency of the work, the technical precision, and the inscriptions from the site all suggest a core of full-time skilled specialists. Stone masons who could shape casing blocks to a fine tolerance. Surveyors who understood alignments and levels. Carpenters making sledges and tools. Rope makers, potters, butchers, water carriers. Overseers and scribes, who did nothing but manage this flow of people and supplies. These specialists probably lived on or near the site for years. Their tombs, found close to the pyramids, are more substantial than those of temporary workers, implying higher status. Some crew names that appear inside the pyramid, those informal red graffiti marks, sound like proud team labels, not the branding of slave gangs, the friends of Khufu, the drunkards of Menkora, joking, boasting, marking their part in the project. So the workforce behind the stones is a layered thing. At the bottom, a broad base of rotating corvée labourers, drawn seasonally from the countryside. Above them, a thinner but steadier layer of skilled workers and artisans, likely attached to royal estates or directly to the pyramid project. At the top of the on-site workforce, overseers, scribes, architects, people whose job was to think, count and command rather than to haul. Where did they sit in society? Not in the palaces, but not in total misery either. For many peasants, corvée duty was probably a mix of burden and opportunity. The work was brutal, hauling sledges, quarrying stone, moving water and mud all day leaves, marks on the body, but the state was feeding you. In a good year that might not matter much. In a lean year, a stint on the king's works could mean guaranteed rations when food back home was uncertain. There was also honour attached to serving the king. In tomb inscriptions, people sometimes boast that they served at the pyramid or worked on particular royal projects. That pride doesn't erase the hardship, but it complicates the picture. Building the king's tomb was, in their worldview, part of maintaining cosmic order. It was both duty and, for some, a path to small advancement, earning a title, a plot of land, or a place in a prestigious cemetery. The conditions, though, were not gentle. Skeletons from the workers' cemeteries show arthritis, stress fractures, signs of repetitive strain. Many of the dead are young adults. Living in crowded barracks with thousands of other labourers probably meant exposure to disease and accidents. Even if the labourers were not slaves in chains, their bodies paid a heavy price for each tier of limestone. How many bodies exactly? Here the answers get hazier. Estimates for the workforce at Giza range widely, from a few thousand permanent personnel with seasonal surges up to perhaps 20 or 30,000 during peak building phases, all the way to older, now less favoured ideas of 100,000 or more. The lower estimates tend to assume a high degree of organisation and long construction timelines, decades in which a relatively modest, well-fed workforce can move a staggering amount of stone with simple tools and careful planning. The higher estimates picture shorter construction windows and less efficiency. Archaeology nudges us toward the more moderate numbers. The size of the workers' town, the capacity of the bakeries and breweries, the cemeteries, the logistics of supplying food and water in that landscape. All of these put practical limits on how many people could realistically be kept there at once. You can command a village to send men. You still have to bake the bread and brew the beer. So instead of imagining an endless sea of faceless slaves, it may be more accurate to picture waves of conscripted farmers cycling through, joining permanent crews of craftsmen and administrators. Men with homes and families up and down the Nile, enduring bone-breaking labour, receiving rations and perhaps a measure of status, all woven into a system that felt, to them, as normal and inevitable as paying taxes does to us. From a distance of 45 centuries, it's easy to see only the stone. But under every block is a human back, and behind every human back is a story of obligation, of ambition, of pride, of exhaustion. To get closer to those stories, we have to leave the abstract idea of labour and walk into the spaces where these people actually slept, ate, and healed. The workers' town still whispers, if you listen closely enough, if you follow the slopes south from the pyramids, and let your mind strip away the sand and modern roads, another city rises in the dark. Not a city of temples and palaces, but of long, narrow rooms, mud-brick walls, and the steady rhythm of thousands of lives on repeat. Archaeologists call it Hayt el Ghurab. Think of it as the backstage of the Giza show. While the pyramids catch the light, this is where the people who lifted them actually lived. The layout is not random. Rows of barracks-like galleries, sometimes 20 or 30 meters long, divided into smaller bays, narrow alleys, storage magazines, a central street that seems to funnel movement toward the plateau. This is planning on a grand scale, a kind of urban design built around one purpose: feed and house the workforce that keeps the King's project moving. Daily life here would have been intensely patterned. A corvée labourer arrives with his group from a village hundreds of kilometres away. A scribe notes his name, his home district, perhaps the crew he's assigned to. He's led to a gallery, finds his spot on a reed mat or along a mud-brick bench. That bay becomes his world for months. Sleep, wake, eat, work, return, talk, sleep again. Morning would start early, a faint coolness in the desert air. Then the bustle as overseers call out crews. Haulers, quarrymen, water carriers, stone dressers, carpenters, all peel off in different directions. Some head up toward the ramp systems and working faces of the pyramid. Others stay closer, sharpening copper tools, repairing sledges, grinding grain. The town empties, then slowly refills toward evening as exhausted bodies limp or shuffle back, aching but alive. Behind that daily tide is an invisible machine of logistics, and here the archaeology becomes almost embarrassingly concrete. The ground is littered with pottery sherds, animal bones, ash. The patterns tell a story. Vast quantities of storage jars for grain and beer. Bread moulds by the hundreds, thick layers of ash from industrial ovens. Fish bones, cattle, sheep and goat remains. Someone was feeding this town very well. We're used to imagining pyramid builders as half-starved. The evidence points the other way. These people ate better than many peasants back home. Grain was the foundation. Tax grain collected along the Nile, flowed into royal storehouses, then out again toward the plateau. From the fields of dozens of villages, through granary scribes and boatmen, into the hands of bakers at Giza. They turned it into tens of thousands of loaves a day, standardized, portable bricks of calories. Beer was the other pillar. Not the kind you sip from a glass in a bar, but a thick, nutritious brew, closer to liquid bread. Breweries at Hayt el Ghurab show fixed installations for large-scale production. Big vats, heating installations, channels for draining. Archaeologists estimate that a single brewing complex could have supplied rations for a substantial workforce. Bread and beer together formed a complete diet. Carbohydrates, some protein, water safe enough to drink because it had been boiled and fermented. Then there's the meat. The animal bones from the site include a surprising amount of cattle. Cattle were wealth in ancient Egypt. You don't slaughter them casually for low-status labour you intend to discard. Mixed in are sheep and goats, plus occasional pigs and fish. The pattern suggests a supply chain that knew exactly what it was doing, sending on the hoof animals to be butchered near the worksite, carving them up according to standardized cuts, distributing portions as part of a ration system. This was not a charity kitchen. It was a payroll. You can read hierarchy in the bones too. High-quality beef cuts show up more often in areas associated with administrators or higher-status burials. More modest cuts and smaller animals concentrate near the barracks. Even in an organized work town, status followed you to dinner. Food is only half the story. The other half is written in bones of a different kind, the skeletons in the nearby cemeteries. They show exactly what you'd expect from people moving stone all day. Compressed vertebrae, worn knees and hips, thickened muscle attachment sites on arms and shoulders, fractured ribs, broken legs. It's a catalogue of repetitive strain and heavy load. But many of those injuries had healed. Broken limbs had been set well enough that the bones fused straight. People with serious fractures survived long enough for full healing. That implies more than a shrug and a next man up. It implies treatment and care. There are hints of basic medical practice, splinting, rest, perhaps herbal remedies. At minimum, there was a social system that allowed an injured worker to be fed while he recovered, rather than being thrown aside the moment he could no longer haul. Teeth tell another quiet story. Many skulls show heavy wear from a gritty diet. There was sand in everything, but also signs of reaching adulthood with most teeth still in place. That suggests surprisingly adequate childhood nutrition for at least a portion of this population. Again, not the picture of a disposable underclass starved to the edge of death. Within the town, labour was not one undifferentiated mass. Specialisation is everywhere once you start looking. Carpenters leaving behind wood shavings and tool marks where they shaped sledges, levers, and the wooden frames for copper saws. Stonecutters working raw blocks into more regular shapes before they were hauled uphill, using hammerstones and copper chisels that had to be constantly resharpened. Toolmakers refurbishing copper adzes and chisels, annealing metal in small hearths, cold hammering edges back into usefulness. Rope makers twisting plant fibres into thick cables, capable of surviving the strain of dragging multi-ton stones. Even within hauling crews there were roles, men at the front guiding the sledge, teams at the ropes, water carriers wetting the path, shout leaders coordinating rhythm, scribes at the edges of this whole system, tallying rations, tracking work groups, recording deliveries of stone and supplies with quick strokes of reed pens. Some of these people likely thought of themselves not just as workers but as professionals. A seasoned stone mason, a skilled carpenter, a brewery supervisor. They had expertise. Their skills were portable and valuable, and their tombs and grave goods tend to reflect a notch above the most basic burials. Put all this together, and the old image of enslaved masses begins to look shaky. This doesn't mean the work was gentle or voluntary in any modern sense. Corvée duty was compulsory. You went when your village was told to send men, and you did what you were ordered to do. The schedule was brutal, the risks real. The fact that there was bread, beer, and medical care does not turn the site into a worker's paradise. But the archaeological record from the town makes it hard to sustain a vision of chained, starving captives whipped to death and dumped in pits. Instead, we see something more complex and in some ways more chilling, a well-run, state-backed machine that could mobilize tens of thousands of ordinary Egyptians, feed them, house them, patch them up when they broke, and send them back home when their season was done. For the people living in those barracks, this was life inside the king's shadow. Long days of coordinated effort, nights of noise and fatigue, the smell of baking bread and brewing beer, the ache of overused muscles, the small comforts of talk and routine. From here, from this dense, organized little city, the stone begins its journey. The next step in the story is to follow it back to its source, to the quarries, and to the choices the builders made about what rock would be worthy of a king. Follow that path of stone back from the pyramid face and the workers' town, and you end up in places that, at first glance, don't look very dramatic at all. Low scarps, rough pits, broken rock underfoot. Not the grand cinematic quarries of imagination, but torn edges of the same plateau the pyramids sit on. For most of the mass of those monuments, the Egyptians didn't haul blocks from far away. They dug them out from under their feet. The Giza plateau is a stack of limestones, softer, fossil-rich layers, harder, more compact bands. The builders seem to have understood those differences instinctively, long before anyone talked about geology. For the core of the pyramids, the millions of blocks that make up the bulk, hidden now under rubble and erosion, they mostly used local limestone. It was close, it was good enough, and it came out in big rough chunks that could be shaped just enough to stack. If you walk the desert just southeast of the Great Pyramid, you're basically walking through the ghost of a quarry. Shallow cuttings, step-like faces, abandoned blocks half separated from the bedrock. It's as if someone took a slice out of the plateau and fed it, piece by piece, into the structure rising just uphill. That local stone is not pretty. It can be brittle, full of shell fragments and voids, sometimes fractured. But inside the pyramid, no one would see it. What mattered was volume and availability, not perfection. For what people would see, the outer skin that caught the sun, they were pickier. The casing stones, the ones that once made the pyramids gleam like cut ice, came mostly from finer limestone deposits across the river at places like Tura and Masarar on the east bank. Tura limestone is different. It's denser, creamier, with fewer fossils and a tighter grain. Cut and polished, it reflects light in a way that local Giza stone never could. Imagine a smooth, pale surface under that desert sun, the edges sharp enough to trace with a fingertip. That was the face they wanted to present to the gods and to anyone approaching along the Nile. So there's a hierarchy built right into the rock. Coarse local stone inside, fine imported limestone outside, and then deeper in, something harder still. In certain chambers and passages, especially in the Great Pyramid, the builders turned to granite. Not from Giza, not even from nearby, but from Aswan, hundreds of kilometers upriver. Aswan granite is tough, pink or red, flecked with dark minerals. It laughs at the tools that make quick work of limestone. It's the kind of rock you choose when you want a space to feel inviolable, permanent in a different register than the rest. Granite plugs, granite beams above burial chambers, polished granite sarcophagi. These were stones that had already survived for millions of years in the river cataracts. Dragging them north and coaxing them into precise shapes was a statement in itself. How exactly did they do all this cutting and shaping? Here the romance of lost technologies runs into the stubborn reality of tool marks. Along quarry faces and on unfinished blocks we find tracks that look like what you'd expect from the tools Egyptians actually had. Copper chisels, copper saws, pounding stones, wooden wedges. No hardened steel blades, no diamond-tipped drills, no lasers, however tidy that might be as a story. On limestone, the main tools were simple but effective. Large, rounded hammerstones made from harder rocks. Dolerite, for example, used to pound channels into the bedrock, outlining the sides of a block. Copper chisels and adzes to clean up surfaces, sharpened and resharpened over and over as they dulled and mushroomed. In some quarries and on some blocks, you can trace the rhythm of those blows, parallel grooves where a chisel was driven in at regular intervals, step-like ridges where a hammerstone carved a trench one punch at a time. The pattern looks very human, not perfectly even, a little wobbly, sometimes corrected midway. To detach blocks, they probably used a combination of undercutting and wedges. Workers would cut channels around three sides and then weaken the underside, leaving a rock hinge. Wooden wedges hammered into narrow slots could then be soaked, swelling and forcing the rock to crack along a controlled line. In drier fiction, those wedges split rock with effortless drama. In reality, the process seems to have been slower, messier, more incremental. We know they did something like this because the evidence is literally frozen in place. In a few spots you can see wedges still trapped in ancient cuts or blocks partway freed with thin splits running just where you'd expect them to if someone had been working them loose. Granite posed a different challenge. Copper is no match for hard igneous rock in the way modern tools are. Yet the Egyptians managed columns, sarcophagi, and those massive internal beams. The quarry at Aswan gives clues. There, the famous unfinished obelisk, still fused to the bedrock, shows deep scooped depressions along its sides. They seem to be the work of dolerite pounders, essentially large, hard stones used like giant pecking hammers to slowly bruise and chip away the granite. Imagine hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of blows day after day to free a single monolith. Not a clever shortcut, just relentless application of moderate force by many hands over long periods. You can also see the probable remains of abrasive saws and drills. In some cases, archaeologists have found copper saw blades and tubular drills associated with sand, quartz grains that would have done the actual grinding, with copper just acting as a flexible carrier. Tool marks on granite blocks show narrow, curved striations, consistent with something like this. Not a razor blade slicing through butter, but a cord or saw laboriously drawn back and forth with grit doing the cutting. For all this, there are still many things we can't quantify with much confidence. How efficient were these quarries? How much stone did they waste for every block that made it onto a sledge? How often did a partly cut block fracture badly enough to be abandoned, leaving behind another unfinished puzzle for modern visitors? The landscape hints at a lot of trial and error. There are miscut blocks left in situ, broken slabs tossed aside, scars where a promising seam turned out to be too fractured to use. None of this looks like a world of zero waste and perfect planning. It looks like learning on the job, then systematizing what worked. Tool replacement is another murky area. Copper was valuable, and every chisel edge wore down quickly under hard use. Some experimental reconstructions suggest chisels might have needed reshaping after carving just a few meters of stone. But our numbers are fuzzy. We can count the slag and the spent tools archaeologists have found. We can repeat experiments, yet we still can't say with precision how many tools were cycled through a pyramid's lifetime, or how often a quarryman set down one chisel and picked up another. What we can see clearly is the overall pattern. The Egyptians were choosing stone grades with intent: rough local limestone for bulk, fine Tura limestone for outer brilliance, hard granite for sacred and structurally critical elements. They matched those stones with a toolkit that, while simple by modern standards, was used with skill, patience, and a willingness to accept a certain amount of breakage and waste, from the ground beneath the workers' town to distant cliffs upriver. They were already thinking like engineers and artists at once, balancing effort and quality, proximity and prestige, hardness and workability. Once the right blocks were cut and coaxed free, though a new challenge began. Stone on the ground is one thing, stone in a pyramid is another. Between quarry and rising monument lay an entire landscape to cross, and the Egyptians had to figure out how to move mountains one block at a time. Once a block is free and lying at the quarry's edge, The real problem begins. Gravity has already done its part, pulling it down. Now humans have to persuade it to go sideways. When people imagine this, they often jump straight to rollers, neat rows of round logs under a block, the whole thing trundling along like a primitive conveyor belt. The trouble is, the desert around Giza is not exactly a forest. Wood was a precious resource in ancient Egypt, most of it coming from far away. Using large quantities of round timbers as disposable rollers, then grinding them into the dust under tons of stone, would have been a very expensive habit. There may have been some limited use of rollers in special contexts, but so far, the physical evidence near the pyramids points us towards something simpler, cheaper, and easier to control. Sledges. Think of a heavy wooden frame with runners underneath, like a stripped-down, oversized sled. Put the block on top, lash it in place, and drag. This sounds punishing until you remember two important things. Friction can be managed, and humans are patient when the stakes are high. On tomb walls, including a famous scene from the tomb of Jehutehotep in Middle Egypt, we see large statues being hauled on sledges by lines of men pulling ropes. In one painting, a figure stands at the front of the sledge, pouring what looks like water onto the ground in front of the runners. For a long time, that little detail puzzled people. Was it ritual, symbolic, some sort of offering? Modern experiments suggest something more practical. Dumping water onto dry sand changes how the grains lock together. Too dry, and the sand piles up in front of the sledge. A miniature dune that has to be constantly pushed aside. Slightly damp, and the grains pack more tightly. The sand resists less, and the sledge glides more smoothly. In lab tests and field trials, just the right amount of moisture can cut the pulling force dramatically. Not magic, just physics and observation applied by people who spent their lives watching how earth and water behaved under load. So the basic recipe seems to have been wooden sledges, bare earth or prepared tracks, and lubrication, usually water, possibly mixed with clay or silt in some cases, poured ahead of the runners. Attach enough ropes, line up enough people, and a multi-ton block becomes something that can slowly be coaxed along. For local Giza limestone, taken from quarries right beside the plateau, the distances weren't huge. You could imagine short, intense bursts of hauling from the cutting face to a staging area, from staging area to the base of the pyramid, in a kind of relay. But not all stone was local. Casing blocks from Tura, granite from Aswan, these were not dragged all the way overland. Here, the Nile becomes less a scenic backdrop, and more the spine of the whole operation. River transport is the great multiplier in this story. For much of the year, the Nile floods, turns low ground into waterways, and makes what would be impossible distances on foot or sledge into manageable voyages by boat. A single wooden barge, properly built and handled, can carry far more weight than the same number of people could reasonably drag across dry land. We have depictions of cargo boats, stacked with blocks, inscriptions that record deliveries of stone, and even the remains of harbour installations near Old Kingdom sites. One particularly striking find at Wadi al-Jarf on the Red Sea included papyri from the time of Khufu, one of them apparently a logbook of a crew transporting Tura limestone along canals and the Nile, destined for Akhet Khufu, the horizon of Khufu, which we know as the Great Pyramid. Canals and harbours seem to have been woven deliberately into the pyramid logistics. Near Giza there are traces of a basin or harbour area, now choked with silt and urban sprawl, where boats could have come right up close to the plateau's edge during high water. From there, stone would move only a short distance uphill on sledges. Some researchers think temporary canals may have been dug or widened seasonally to bring boats even nearer. The pyramid site itself is not a random spot in the desert. It's close enough to the river's floodplain to tap into water transport, high enough on the plateau to escape inundation, and laid out so that causeways, Broad, straight corridors run from valley temples near the water up to the pyramid complexes. These causeways weren't just ceremonial routes. They look very much like logistics pipelines. Imagine wide, gently sloping ramps, paved or at least carefully levelled, bounded by walls that help keep loads from drifting sideways. Along them, sledges could be dragged in organised lines, up from boat landings and valley temples towards staging areas closer to the growing pyramid. At Giza, we also see what look like broad, levelled platforms and yards around the pyramids and temples. These flat zones may have served as sorting and waiting areas, places to offload blocks from boats or from quarries, to park them, to reorder them, and to send them up to the work fronts in the right sequence. Because not every block was equal. Core blocks of local limestone were relatively small by the standards of giant monuments, often in the range of a ton or two, awkward but manageable for groups of workers on a single sledge. You could move many of them in a steady rhythm. Quarry, drag, stage, lift, place. Casing stones from Chura were larger, heavier, and more precisely shaped. They needed more care, more controlled handling, and perhaps teams with more experience. Their journey was longer: boat, canal, harbour, causeway, final ascent. And any mistake along the line meant breaking not just a rock, but a piece of the monument's outer skin. Granite elements were another category entirely. Those giant beams over the king's chamber, or the great sarcophagus blocks, can weigh dozens of tons. Moving them likely meant bigger sledges, more elaborate rope systems, more workers coordinated closely, and maybe special prepared tracks with extra reinforcement. So logistics weren't one size fits all. The Egyptians appear to have matched transport methods to block type: small rough blocks in bulk, medium-sized fine casing stones in carefully managed batches, rare, massive granite pieces with almost obsessive caution. How sure can we be about all this when the actual wood and rope are long gone? Here the picture emerges from a kind of triangulation. Archaeology gives us fragments, traces of harbour basins, remains of causeways, worn stone that looks like it carried sledges, inscriptions about stone deliveries, tomb paintings of hauling scenes, occasional bits of rope or wood preserved in dry or flooded contexts. Engineering and experimental archaeology fill in some gaps. Researchers have built replica sledges, loaded them with blocks of comparable size, and tried to move them over sand and prepared tracks, with and without water. They varied team sizes, rope arrangements, and surface treatments. The forces they measure line up reasonably well with what teams of human pullers could sustain, especially if the work was organised and paced. But there are still uncertainties. We don't know exactly how smooth the ancient tracks were, how systematically they watered the sand, how often they switched teams, how they coordinated songs, commands, and rest breaks. We don't know how many boats were operating in peak season, or how many blocks could be staged on the plateau at once without chaos. What we see, instead of a perfectly mapped system, is a framework that works in principle and fits the scattered clues we have: sledges and dampened ground instead of endless forests of rollers, boats and canals turning the Nile into a stone highway, harbours, causeways, and staging yards knitting water, quarry, and pyramid into a single moving machine. Block sizes and stone types dictating different levels of care, power, and planning. Through all of it, the same quiet lesson: they did not need lost technologies to move stone. They needed organisation, patience, and an intimate familiarity with sand, slope, water, and weight. Knowledge gained the hard way, over years of watching how the land responded when you tried to drag a mountain across it. Once those blocks reached the base of the pyramid, yet another problem awaited them. It was one thing to move stone over mostly level ground. It was another to raise it, layer by layer, into a structure that climbed stories into the air. Before a single block could be raised, someone had to decide exactly where the mountain of stone would stand and how it would meet the earth. The Giza plateau looks flat from a distance. Up close it isn't. It's a natural shelf of limestone, sloping, cracked and uneven, cut by ancient gullies and studded with harder rock. Turning that into a base for a pyramid meant more than just finding a nice view of the Nile. It meant reshaping the ground itself. Archaeological work on the plateau shows long, shallow cuttings in the bedrock, traces of trenches and channels where softer layers were carved away. In some places under Khufu's pyramid, the natural rock was left standing in a low core, and the rest of the foundation was levelled to meet it. In others, the limestone was shaved down with almost obsessive care, leaving a surface that, over hundreds of metres, deviates from true level by only a couple of centimetres. That kind of accuracy does not happen by eyeballing. However they did it, the planners of Giza were thinking in 3 dimensions from the very beginning, not just where the pyramid would sit, but how the living rock under it would carry the load of millions of tons. Softer layers had to go, cracks had to be bridged or avoided. The foundation had to be coherent enough that the whole mass would not settle unevenly and twist itself apart over time. Once the ground was roughly prepared, the next challenge was more abstract: orientation. The big pyramids do not just sit anywhere, in any direction. Their sides are astonishingly close to the cardinal points, north, south, east and west. On Khufu's pyramid, the mean deviation from true north is measured in minutes of arc, tiny fractions of a degree. How? We don't have an Old Kingdom handbook of field procedures, but several plausible methods have been proposed. One idea is that surveyors used the stars. If you watch circumpolar stars, the ones that circle near the north celestial pole, rise and set, you can mark when a particular star is at its easternmost and westernmost positions. Bisect that angle and you get a north-south line. Another possibility is that they tracked the shadow of a vertical pole during the day. The shortest shadow at local noon points due north-south. With patient observation over many days, you could refine that line, checking for consistency. Both techniques require a simple toolkit: plumb lines to define vertical, stakes or stones to record positions, and cords to connect them. All of those are well within what we know Egyptians used. Once a reliable north-south line was fixed on the ground, a perpendicular east-west line could be laid out by geometry, dividing right angles with chords and triangles created from lengths of rope. In later periods, we know Egyptian surveyors used knotted cords to mark regular intervals and ratios. There's no reason to think their Old Kingdom predecessors were any less capable. With orientation set, the base had to be squared. Imagine teams of surveyors walking the rough, levelled rock, stretching cords from one corner marker to another, checking with plumb bobs to make sure the lines were straight and angles true. Copper or stone pegs pounded into the limestone would fix key reference points. Between them, the surface could be brought down or built up with masonry to match an invisible geometric plan. Measurement itself revolved around the cubit, a forearm-based unit of about 52 centimetres in the Old Kingdom, divided into palms and fingers. For larger distances, multiples of cubits could be laid out with measuring rods or cords. When you see the base lengths of pyramids expressed in neat, whole numbers of cubits, it's hard not to imagine someone or a group of someones sitting with a design in mind, working in fractions and multipliers, then translating that idea into stakes and strings on the plateau. The geometry was not just about the footprint. Inside the mass of stone, spaces had to be carved and threaded. Descending passages, ascending corridors, horizontal tunnels, niches, antechambers, the main burial chamber, and above it, cavities to relieve the crushing weight of the superstructure. In Khufu's pyramid, the king's chamber sits not at ground level but high within the body of the monument, its granite walls and ceiling beams locked into a web of stone. Above it, a stack of so-called relieving chambers, roofed with massive granite slabs and capped by gabled limestone blocks, spreads the load. This implies a design that anticipates stress paths, where weight will travel, where it must be redirected. Whether that understanding came from formal calculation, accumulated building experience, or some blend of the two, it was not accidental. You do not move dozens of colossal granite beams more than 40 meters above the ground into a confined interior void on a whim, and yet even within this astonishing planning, we can see the human hand precise, but not perfect. The base of Khufu's pyramid is not a mathematically flawless square. Each side is slightly different in length. The corners are not perfectly right angles, just impressively close. The supposedly straight casing lines show micro variations. The angle of the faces is not identical on every side, and the overall slope seems to have been adjusted during construction. Inside, the same pattern holds. Passageways deviate a little from strict cardinal alignment. Joints between blocks vary in tightness. Some corridors change angle or size mid-run, possibly reflecting decisions made during the build, or responses to issues revealed as they cut deeper into the rock. At Giza and elsewhere, we see abandoned or modified features, a lower chamber left unfinished, a corridor that ends abruptly, niches whose purpose is debated. These may be traces of shifts in plan. Pharaoh dies earlier than expected, religious requirements change, structural concerns arise, or simply the reality of trial and error on a monumental scale. So, the planning of a pyramid seems to sit at the intersection of ideal and real. On one side, there is the abstraction, cardinals and cubits, perfect squares and precise slopes, invisible lines drawn from stars to sand. On the other, there is messy limestone, irregular fractures, human fatigue, and the need to adapt as the work uncovers surprises in the ground and in the stone. What emerges is not a machine-made perfection, but a very human precision, careful, consistent, aiming at ideals but constrained by time, tools, and the fallible bodies that hauled the cords and held the plumb lines. With the site chosen, the plateau tamed, the base squared and oriented, and the interior paths sketched into the rock, the project had a skeleton and a map. Only then could the visible pyramid, the rising stepped mass of stone that would dominate the horizon, begin to grow. Once the first course of blocks was in place around the base, the real puzzle began. How do you keep adding stone on top for years until the structure is hundreds of courses high? People have been arguing about that for centuries. The most straightforward answer is also the most physically demanding, a big, straight ramp. In this picture, as the pyramid grows, a long earthen causeway stretches out from one side, sloping gently up to the current working level. Blocks are dragged along it on sledges, hauled by teams of workers. It's simple to imagine and easy to sketch in a textbook. The problem comes when you do the math. To keep the slope shallow enough for people to haul multi-ton blocks, the ramp would have to be very long. By the time Khufu's pyramid reached anything like its final height, a straight ramp would stretch so far out into the desert that its own volume of material might rival or even exceed the pyramid itself. That's a lot of extra work for something you plan to dismantle at the end. Because of that, some researchers have suggested more compact solutions, ramps that hug the monument instead of running away from it. One idea is a zigzag or switchback ramp, climbing one face in a series of doglegs. Instead of a single straight road, you get terraces and turns, blocks being hauled up one segment, then turned and dragged along the next. This drastically reduces the amount of fill you need, but it introduces a different challenge, maneuvering heavy stones around tight corners on inclined surfaces, without modern machinery. Another version coils around the whole structure. In this spiral ramp hypothesis, a broad ramp wraps around the pyramid like a ribbon, rising as the courses rise. Work crews and sledges circle slowly upward, always on a roughly level surface relative to the course they're building. From a distance, during construction, The monument might have looked less like a smooth pyramid and more like a stepped hill with a road snaking around it. Spiral ramps solve some problems and create others. They're shorter overall and reuse their own structure as they climb, but they also obscure the corners and faces. That matters because the corners are where surveyors needed to check alignment and slope. If those edges are buried under earthworks, it's harder to keep the geometry precise as you go higher. Then there's a more radical suggestion that at least part of the ramp system might have been inside. An internal ramp model imagines that once a low outer shell of the pyramid and its base courses were in place, workers used a rising corridor cut within that mass, turning at the corners to haul blocks up to higher levels. As the pyramid rose, the ramp rose with it, an invisible spiral tunnel just under the skin of the monument. Short shafts out to the faces would have allowed stones to be pulled the last few meters into place. This idea is clever and has passionate defenders, but it's far from proven. The internal corridors that have actually been detected so far tend to be either very ancient structural features or much later intrusions. Clear, continuous ramp-like tunnels have not yet turned up in the way the boldest versions of the theory would need. What the evidence does suggest is that we may not need to pick a single system at all. On the plateau at other pyramids and monumental sites, archaeologists have found traces of more modest ramps, straight approaches, lateral access ramps along sides, and compact stair-like inclines. At Giza itself, there are remains of ramps associated with the quarries and the lower stages of construction. None of these, taken alone, explains how the very highest courses were reached, but together they hint at something important. Methods probably changed over time. It's entirely possible that the earliest stages used a broad, relatively low ramp, bringing blocks up from the quarries to the base and first few layers. As the pyramid grew taller and the mass itself became a huge stable platform, the builders could have shifted to closer, lighter solutions, shorter ramps against the faces, zigzagging terraces, and more localized lift systems. Because ramps are temporary, their upper sections are exactly what we'd expect to vanish when the job is done. Earth and rubble are easy to strip away, reuse or let erode. What survives in the archaeology are the ghosts at the edges, foundations, cuts in the bedrock, odd embankments whose original shape is hard to reconstruct with certainty. Ramps, though, were only part of the story. Getting a stone up to the right level is one thing. Sliding it into its precise final position is another. Here, smaller-scale techniques come into play. Scaffolding, wooden frameworks and platforms could be erected around specific problem areas, especially near the top where full-scale ramps are least practical. We know Egyptians used wooden scaffolds in later periods for temple and tomb work. There's no reason to exclude them from the Old Kingdom toolkit. Levers are even more fundamental. A simple wooden lever with a stone or wooden fulcrum lets a crew nudge a heavy block a few centimeters at a time. Combined with wet sand or lubricated surfaces and small stone chocks, levers can walk a block sideways, lift one end into exact alignment, or ease it down gently onto the course below. You don't need complex machinery, just an understanding that a long pole gives you mechanical advantage, and the patience to move slowly. Incremental lift strategies likely did the fine work. Imagine a block hauled to a platform just below where it needs to go. Workers slide it onto wooden cribbing, stacks of timbers, then use levers to raise it one notch at a time, adding shims under it as they go. Lift, support, reset the lever, lift again. Step by step, the stone climbs. Once it reaches the correct height, the cribbing is carefully removed and the block eased into its final bed. All of this happened within an evolving sequence of construction. The core of the pyramid, the stepped, inward-leaning mass of rougher limestone blocks, seems to have gone up first, course by course, creating a rising, jagged mountain. The fine Tura limestone casing, the gleaming outer skin, was attached as the core advanced, but not necessarily completed at the same pace everywhere. Some faces might have been dressed and finished earlier, others left rough, with projecting stones and unfinished joints to be smoothed only when the ramps and scaffolding that pressed against them were finally removed. In places there are signs that casing stones were cut back or readjusted, suggesting an ongoing dialogue between plan and reality as the monument rose. Near the summit, methods likely changed again. With the working area shrinking and the pyramid narrowing, broad ramps become less economical, and the value of scaffolds, short ramps, and pure muscle with levers increases. The very topmost blocks, including the final capstone, may have been raised by extremely localized means, cribbing towers, stacked platforms, or even something as simple as an earthen mound piled against just the upper tiers and then scraped away. Through it all, there is no single universally accepted master ramp that solves every problem. Instead, there is a landscape of plausible techniques, each strong in some situations and weak in others, and a monument that probably saw several of them used in sequence and combination, adapting to changing heights, changing needs, and changing insights as the work progressed. What remains certain is not the exact route each block took, but the outcome: millions of stones, laid in consistent horizontal courses, their joints interlocking, rising from a level plateau into a coherent geometric form that still stands. How precisely the Egyptians orchestrated the choreography of ramps, levers, scaffolds, and finishing steps is a question that continues to invite experiments and debate. But whatever the final details, by the time the outer surfaces were smoothed and the capstone set, the builders had already demonstrated something more than engineering. They had shown an ability to organize thousands of people over decades, to adjust methods midstream, and to keep a common project moving, upward against gravity and time. To understand who those people were and what their lives looked like while the pyramid was climbing into the sky, we have to step away from the stone for a moment and walk down toward the edge of the plateau, where the workers ate, slept, and dreamed. If you take a flashlight to the base of the Great Pyramid today, in places where the casing is gone and the core is exposed, you see something revealing. The stones aren't all perfect. Some joints are tight enough that it's hard to slip a knife blade between them. Others have small gaps, packed with chips and gypsum mortar. Edges are sometimes razor sharp, sometimes a bit battered. The overall impression is not of machine-made uniformity, but of handwork. Skilled handwork, but still very human. That's an important clue about tools, technique, and speed. When people talk about the astonishing precision of the pyramids, they're often thinking of a small number of places where exactness really did matter. The corner blocks at the base, the foundation platform that had to be levelled, the inner chambers and passages where misalignment of a few centimetres could throw off a whole corridor. At those points, tolerances seem to have been extremely tight. Casing stones from the lower courses show contact faces dressed so flat and true that the joints between adjacent blocks are barely visible. Inside the king's chamber, the granite blocks fit with remarkable regularity. The floor is astonishingly level, but this precision was focused, not universal. Deep in the core, where a stone will never be seen again, and its main job is to bear weight and lock against its neighbours, the finish is rougher. The faces that meet may be only roughly trimmed, small voids between them are bridged by wedges and mortar. As long as the mass is stable and the courses stay level, perfection on every surface is wasted effort. So the builders seem to have made choices. Work the visible faces harder. Take more time on the seating surfaces that transmit load. Be especially careful along the corners and the base, where any error multiplies upward. Accept cruder work in the interior, where what matters most is bulk, not beauty. This selective precision helps when we try to imagine the pace of work. It means we don't have to picture every block as a masterpiece of stone carving. Many were probably roughed out quickly at the quarry. then given just enough dressing on the key faces to fit into their slot. Researchers have tried for decades to turn that intuition into numbers. How many blocks per day? How many workers per block? How many years to complete Khufu's pyramid if you assume a certain crew size and working season? You can find very confident answers in popular accounts. 20 years, 100,000 workers, 1 block every 2 minutes. But each of those neat figures rests on layers of assumption. Assumptions about how many days a year work could continue in the desert heat, about how long each stone took to quarry, trim, haul and place, about how often tools broke, how many people were diverted to repair ramps, dig new borrow pits or bring food and water. Change any one of those inputs and the final estimate slides. What the calculations do show, even when they differ, is that the project is not physically impossible with Bronze Age technology. If a single crew can lever a multi-ton block into place in a day or two, and you have many such crews working in parallel, some at the quarry, some on the ramps, some at the setting face, you can over decades accumulate millions of placements. Division of labour is the hidden multiplier. Quarry gangs cut and rough-shape the limestone, freeing blocks along pre-planned seams. Hauling crews take over once a block is ready, loading it onto sledges, dragging it along prepared roads, pausing at rest stations and water points. At the pyramid's edge, transfer teams manage the transition from horizontal hauling to ramps and lifts. Up on the courses, setters and finishers do a different kind of work. Setters position each block, using levers and chocks to nudge it into alignment with the course line. Finishers trim the exposed faces, chip down high spots, adjust joints, and apply mortar where needed. Toolmakers and maintainers hover around this whole system, sharpening copper chisels, rehafting stone pounders, repairing sledges and levers. No one group has to understand the entire process. Each specialises, and that specialisation speeds things up. Over the life of the project, speed likely increased. At the very beginning, even master builders are still learning how that particular bedrock behaves, how the chosen quarry stone fractures, how the planned slope and course height feel when translated into actual blocks. Early on, mistakes are more common. Blocks need to be redressed. A ramp proves fragile and has to be reinforced. Crews move more cautiously, but as seasons go by, experience hardens into routine. Tool designs stabilise, the angle and weight of the copper saws, the preferred shape of dolerite pounders, the pattern of hammer blows that frees the cleanest block, all of that can be standardised and taught. You can imagine a foreman showing a new crew. This is how wide we make the bed of a sled. This is how we score the underside of a block to give it grip. This is how much water to pour on the sand. Do it the same way every time, and the process becomes predictable. Predictability is the friend of speed. Standardization shapes the blocks themselves. If most stones in a given zone of the pyramid are roughly the same size and shape, setters can work more quickly. They don't need to puzzle out a custom arrangement for each row. They know that a certain course uses a particular module of block, and they place them in a repeating pattern. Odd-sized fill stones and complex joints are reserved for problem areas, corners, and transitions. Modern experimental archaeology has tried to test some of these ideas. Crews with replica tools have quarried limestone blocks using dolerite pounders, split stone with wooden wedges, and hauled multi-ton loads on sledges over sand and wooden tracks. The results suggest the Egyptians' methods are plausible. A small, well-organised team really can move and position heavy stones without machines, given time and practice. But experiments have limits. They usually run for days or weeks, not decades. Volunteers tire and lose enthusiasm. Ancient workers lived within the system, trained from youth, and had social and religious reasons to persist. Modern safety standards prevent researchers from pushing people and materials to the edge of failure in the way a pharaonic project might have done. And experiments rely on reconstructions of tools and techniques that are themselves best guesses. So experimental work can demonstrate possibility and give rough orders of magnitude for effort. It can show that one ramp gradient is more efficient than another, or that wetting sand under a sledge reduces friction. It cannot with certainty tell us the exact rate at which Khufu's builders advanced, or how many blocks they placed in a season. Somewhere between the slow, careful pace of a modern demonstration and the heroic numbers of popular legend lies the real rhythm of work at Giza. Not impossibly fast, not leisurely, just the steady accumulation of small repeated tasks, done by hands that had become expert at their particular slice of the process. Over years that rhythm left its mark in the stone itself, in the way faces were dressed, joints were closed, and blocks were standardized and slotted together. It also left its mark in another, more personal way, in the traces of the workers who sometimes, very quietly, wrote their own presence into the monument. Those traces are not grand inscriptions on polished casing. They are rough red daubs hidden in dark places, where no visitor was ever meant to go. When the Great Pyramid was first explored from the inside, 19th century visitors forced their way into a series of small spaces above the king's chamber. These are the so-called relieving chambers, flat-roofed compartments stacked one on top of another, separated by massive granite beams. Their purpose seems to have been structural, a way to spread the weight of millions of tons of masonry around the central room so its ceiling would not collapse. They are awkward, cramped voids, no ceremonial decoration, no smooth limestone, just rough stone surfaces, dusty corners, and on some of those stones painted marks. They look almost casual, short lines of hieroglyphs, crudely drawn in red, just good enough that the right person could read them. They are not carved with care, they are slapped on. They say things like, the gang of the Horus Medjedu, using one of Khufu's royal names, or the drunkards of Menkaure in other pyramids of the 4th dynasty. Sometimes they specify aside, the Friends of Khufu Gang, North. Elsewhere you see notations that look more like construction tags, course numbers, orientation marks, marks that probably told a crew, this block goes here, this face outward, this end to the west. Taken together, they suggest a very particular kind of organisation. Work crews seem to have been grouped into larger teams, gangs, each with a name. Those gangs may have been subdivided into files, smaller squads with their own titles. The names are often playful, even boastful. Some tie the crew to the king himself. Others have a joking, almost tavern-like feel, calling themselves the drunks or the excellent ones. This kind of naming does more than help with logistics. It builds identity. If you belong to the Friends of Khufu, you are not just another back in a labour column. You are part of a specific team with a reputation. Your performance can be compared with that of rival gangs. Your mark on a block is a tiny claim. We handled this stone. We placed it. We were here. Morale leaves faint fingerprints. It is possible that the nicknames were assigned from above, a bureaucratic way to track work quotas. It is also possible that the workers themselves leaned into them, turning official labels into sources of pride and friendly rivalry. Ancient Egyptian art from other contexts shows rowing teams, scribal groups, and temple staffs with similar collective names. There is no reason to think quarry gangs were less human. The red graffiti in the relieving chambers has also become a lightning rod, because those spaces are so hard to reach. Some modern skeptics have argued that the marks were forged in the 19th century to prove Khufu's authorship. The style and language of the inscriptions, however, fit comfortably in the Old Kingdom. They use royal names and signs in a way that would have been difficult to fake convincingly before Egyptology really existed as a discipline. Later discoveries of similar gang names in other, untouched 4th dynasty structures strengthen their authenticity. Still, caution is healthy. No single piece of evidence should be taken as absolute proof of anything so complex as who built the pyramid. The crew marks tell us that, at some point in the construction, teams working under Khufu's name handled those particular blocks. They do not, by themselves, settle every question about earlier foundations, later modifications, or secret chambers. They are one thread in a larger web. Other threads come from the ground at Giza and from papyri found far away on the Red Sea coast. Alongside the workers' town near the pyramids, excavators have unearthed fragments of inscribed potsherds and small labels. These often carry short notes, delivery marks, personal names, tallies of goods. By themselves they are tantalizing but incomplete, like hearing one side of a conversation. Then in 2013, something remarkable emerged at the site of Wadi al-Jarf, an ancient harbour on the Gulf of Suez. A cache of papyri from the end of Khufu's reign, including what appears to be a logbook of a work crew. It is not a blueprint for the Great Pyramid. It does not describe the laying of courses or the angle of ramps. Instead, it follows a gang led by an inspector named Mera as they shuttle back and forth along the Nile, transporting limestone from the Tura quarries to Akhet Khufu, horizon of Khufu, a phrase usually understood as referring to the pyramid complex. The text is dry in the way that bureaucratic documents often are. Each entry covers a few days. It notes when the crew is at Tura loading stone, when they are sailing downstream toward Giza, when they are tied up at a particular dock or canal. Occasionally it mentions high officials, the overseers to whom Mera reports. Sometimes it notes the completion of a delivery. In that dryness lies a living system. You glimpse scheduled rotations, days on the river, days at the quarry, days perhaps spent at the building site itself. You see how stone from far away had to be slotted into a larger calendar of work. The papyri imply that the pyramid could not exist without an invisible infrastructure of scribes, boatmen, storehouse managers, and overseers who never touched the core blocks but kept the flow of materials steady. Other administrative texts from roughly the same era, though not always directly tied to Giza, fill in more pieces. Records speak of rations, bread, beer, onions, meat, allocated to work crews by count. They suggest that workers were fed according to rank and task. Longer entries track transfers of barley and emmer to bakeries and breweries, which in turn supplied large labour forces. From these, historians infer a web of obligations and schedules. A hauling crew that arrives hungry or late throws off the timetable. A missed delivery of grain can ripple outward, affecting dozens of gangs. The methodical style of these records hints at a society in which time, labour and food were increasingly quantified. The pyramid builders are not just moving stone, they are moving within a managed system that tries to predict and provision their needs. But the record is patchy. Few papyri from the Old Kingdom survive at all. Most of what we have comes from special preservation environments, desert caves, sealed galleries, dry harbour sites. For every logbook like Mera's that was accidentally saved, many others must have crumbled away. We catch isolated months in a single crew's life, not the full span of the project. We see certain kinds of transactions, stone shipments, grain rations, while countless conversations, decisions, and small crises went unrecorded or were written on perishable media that left no trace. So historians read between the lines. They compare the gang names daubed in red high in the core with the work teams listed on ration documents. They imagine how a foreman's shout on the ramp might echo, faintly, in a scribe's neat hieratic script. They test whether the shipping schedules in one papyrus could, in principle, sustain the stone supply implied by the archaeology at Giza. The picture that emerges is vivid, but never fully in focus. We can say that people at Giza named themselves, organised into gangs, and left their marks on hidden stones. We can say that scribe's somewhere, On the Nile, in harbours, in depots, tracked the movement of those people and their supplies in a calm tabular hand. We can suspect that the same mentality that grouped workers into friends of Khufu and drunkards of Menkaure also grouped days into work periods, deliveries into quotas, offerings into balanced accounts. Beyond that, much remains inferred. The voices we hear are those of overseers and scribes, not the grunts of the ramp or the exhausted laughter after a long haul. To understand why so many people accepted this discipline, why they showed up day after day to move stone for someone else's tomb, we have to look not just at names and numbers, but at belief. For that we turn from the graffiti in the chambers and the ink on papyrus to a different kind of inscription, the stories the builders told themselves about gods, kings, and what pyramids actually did in the cosmos. For the people who hauled those blocks, the pyramid was not just a very large tomb. It was part of a machine that kept the world running. In the royal ideology of the Old Kingdom, the king was not only a man. He was a bridge while alive. He stood between gods and people, receiving divine power and redistributing it as order, fertility, and justice. When he died, he did not simply vanish. Texts from later pyramids and from royal tombs describe a complex transformation. The king becomes an Ak, an effective spirit. He ascends to the sky, joins the circumpolar stars, sails with the sun god, and continues to act. The pyramid, in this way of thinking, is less a grave than a launch vehicle. Its sloping sides recall sunbeams. Its name, Akhet Khufu, Horizon of Khufu, frames it as the place where heaven and earth meet. The narrow internal shafts that climb from the central chambers may have been imagined as pathways for the king's spirit to reach particular star fields. The burial chamber itself, deep in the mass of stone, is a kind of chrysalis. The body lies there, but the king's soul is expected to emerge, renewed, powerful, plugged back into the circuits of the cosmos. If that works, everyone benefits. The dead king, now fully divine, helps the sun rise, keeps the Nile in its proper course, restrains chaos, ensures that the flood comes at the right time and pests do not devour the crops. He intercedes with other gods. He protects Egypt's borders from enemies both human and supernatural. In that worldview, working on his pyramid is not simply serving one man's vanity. It is contributing to a national survival strategy, and the pyramid is only one part of that strategy. Around it sprawls a whole complex that historians see as a living institution. On the east side of the pyramid lies the mortuary temple, pressed up against the base. Here, priests perform daily rituals for the dead king, washing the statue, presenting bread and beer, burning incense, reciting offering formulas. To the south or east, chapels and subsidiary pyramids serve queens and royal family members. Long stone causeways decorated on the inside with reliefs run downhill to valley temples nearer the river. At the valley temple, bodies are received and purified. At the mortuary temple, offerings are made. Along the causeway, processions travel back and forth carrying food and ritual objects. Warehouse rooms store grain, beer jars, cattle. Administrative offices manage lands and labour units whose output supports the cult. All of this continues long after construction ends. Theoretically, for as long as the king's cult functions, and in some cases records suggest that is decades or centuries, people are employed to bake bread, brew beer, tend herds, maintain buildings, replace worn linen on statues. The pyramid complex becomes a permanent economic node, anchoring estates scattered across Egypt that send in their quotas. So when a farmer is drafted into a work rotation at Giza, he is not only toiling for a structure that will be sealed when the king is buried. He is helping to build the central shrine of a long-term institution, one that his grandchildren might serve as priests, guards, or scribes. This is where religion and power intertwine. Mobilizing tens of thousands of people to move stone is not just an engineering problem. It is an exercise in legitimacy. Each worker who participates, each village that sends men or grain, is woven a little more tightly into the king's story. They have a stake in the monument's completion. Their effort, their sweat, is converted into a visible, enduring proof that the king really does occupy a special, central role. Participation could also be social capital. There are hints, later inscriptions, analogy with other large projects that service on royal works could be a way to earn favour, build connections, or simply enjoy a change from rural routine. Being part of the Friends of Khufu gang might mean access to better rations for a season, contact with central officials, perhaps even a commemorative mention on a block or a pot shard. For young men, especially, a stint at Giza might have been a rite of passage. Hard, dangerous sometimes, but also a shared experience that created bonds beyond the home village. Stories told back by returning workers about the size of the stones, the bustle of the workers' town, the rituals glimpsed at the pyramid base, would reinforce the sense that something immense and important was happening there. The human cost, though, was real. Skeletons from burial grounds near the workers' town show stress injuries, vertebrae compressed from heavy lifting, fractures that healed crooked, arthritis in relatively young individuals. Some show healed trauma from accidents. Diet was not terrible, many had access to meat, but labour was gruelling, especially in peak seasons when the inundation made agricultural work impossible and the state could pull more people into construction. From a modern individualist perspective, the trade may seem uneven. Risk and effort in exchange for a promise about someone else's afterlife and the general well-being of the land. But within a culture that took the king's cosmic role for granted, that believed offerings and rituals literally fed and sustained the dead and the gods, the logic could feel different. To help ensure the king's successful transformation was, indirectly, to help ensure your own survival and that of your descendants. If the world stayed in order, your fields would flood properly, your children would have food, your own modest tomb could function within the same sacred system. And there is something else, something more universal. Cultures across time and space pour resources into monumentality, even when they are not wealthy enough by our standards to afford it. Stone circles, cathedrals, mosques, imperial avenues, skyscraper skylines. Again and again, societies accept strain, tax burdens, diverted labour, even occasional famine risk, to create enduring structures that are massively larger than any individual life. Why? One answer is that monuments make abstractions visible. Power, faith, unity, the continuity of the state, these are intangible. A mountain of precisely set stone, aligned with the cardinal points and the sun's path, is very tangible. It anchors belief. It tells both insiders and outsiders. This society can coordinate thousands of people, command huge resources, and think on the scale of centuries. Another answer is psychological. Humans seem to derive meaning from contributing to something that will outlast them. A peasant who helps quarry a single block may never see the entire pyramid finished, but he knows that his effort is literally built into a structure that will stand, in his imagination, forever. That knowledge can soften suffering, make blisters and sore backs feel like the price of significance instead of meaningless pain. In Old Kingdom Egypt, these layers, cosmic theology, political legitimacy, social identity, personal meaning, stacked together as tightly as the courses of stone. The pyramid might start as a royal project, but by the time it rose above the floodplain, it had become a national story in limestone about how the world worked, who sat at its centre, and what ordinary people could do to keep the whole fragile system from sliding back into chaos. And yet, outside any ideology, stone is still stone. The king's body still dies, the workforce still ages and disappears. To see how that tension plays out, between the promises the pyramids embodied and the alternative stories people have told about them ever since, we have to step back and listen to other voices, much later ones that looked at Giza's silhouettes and decided the official explanation could not possibly be enough. Stand at the base of Khufu's pyramid and look up into that mass of stone, and it is not hard to understand why some people look for answers far beyond Old Kingdom Egypt. From a distance of 45 centuries, the official story can feel almost too ordinary. A king, a bureaucracy, a lot of limestone, a lot of sweat. No secret energy beams, no vanished super science, no visitors from the stars. So, over the last few hundred years, other stories have grown up around Giza. Stories about lost continents, forgotten golden ages, and technologies more advanced than anything we have now. They can be imaginative, even beautiful. They can also tell us more about modern hopes and fears than about ancient Egypt. One of the most persistent is the Atlantis idea, that some advanced civilization, now lost under the sea or erased by catastrophe, taught the Egyptians how to build. If that were true, though, the pyramids would not stand alone. Civilizations that can plan and execute projects on this scale leave trails. Not just one monument, but layers of them. Quarries with experimental cuts. Settlements with workshops and tool debris. Broken, imperfect versions of the final design. A whole cascade of earlier attempts and side projects scattered across landscapes and centuries. At Giza, and at earlier pyramid sites, that is exactly what we see, but the trail runs into Egypt's own past, not into some unknown civilization. Before there is Khufu's pyramid, there is Djoser's step pyramid at Saqqara, and the bent pyramid of Sneferu at Dashur, with its change of angle partway up. There are collapsed projects and incomplete foundations. There are administrative papyri from later reigns describing stone deliveries, work crews and rations. What we do not see is a foreign layer, tools of unfamiliar materials, inscriptions in alien scripts, city plans unlike anything else in the Nile Valley. Pottery styles and burial customs shift slowly and recognizably from earlier Egyptian phases to the Pyramid Age and beyond. The people living around these monuments look, in their material culture, like Egyptians whose ancestors had been on that land for centuries, not like recent arrivals trained by strangers from somewhere else. A second cluster of ideas moves even further from Earth, the notion that the pyramids were built by extraterrestrials. On one level, this is a very modern myth. It appears when science fiction appears, when rockets and radio telescopes make space feel close, and when the idea of beings vastly more advanced than us becomes part of popular culture. On another level, it echoes much older patterns. Human societies have often explained imposing ruins by giving them superhuman builders, giants, gods, legendary kings. In that sense, aliens are just our age's version of giants. The cultural appeal is easy to see. If everyday Bronze Age farmers and craftsmen could shape stone so precisely, it suggests that ordinary humans are capable of immense coordination and patience. If only aliens could do it, then the cosmos is full of marvels, and our past becomes part of a grand interstellar drama. There is, however, a quieter side to this story. Many of the sites most often claimed to be too advanced for their own builders are in places with long histories of colonialism and racism. To say, even unintentionally, that brown and black peoples could not possibly have built their own monuments is to repeat an old habit, giving credit to anyone except the actual ancestors. Archaeology, by contrast, finds human fingerprints everywhere. Stone tools, copper chisels, wood sledges, rope, post holes where scaffolding stood, workers' graffiti, a cemetery of builders within sight of the pyramids. None of this looks like the residue of advanced alien technology. It looks like the very human pattern of trial and error, adaptation and repair. Another set of alternative claims focuses not on who built the pyramids, but on whether they could have built them with the tools we think they had. You may have heard that the stones are fitted with microscopic precision, that the base is perfectly aligned to true north, that the chambers are level to fractions of a millimetre over vast distances. From there it is a short step to saying, this is impossible without lasers and machines. What happens when surveyors actually measure? The base of the Great Pyramid is impressively square and aligned, but not perfectly so. One side is a little longer than another by several centimetres. The alignment to true north is very close, within a fraction of a degree, but not exact. Joint gaps in the outer casing, where it survives, can be extremely tight in places and wider in others. Interior passages waver a bit, shift a bit, correct themselves. Far from revealing inhuman perfection, detailed measurements show something more familiar, extraordinary skill pushing against practical limits. Teams working as carefully as they can with the tools they have, correcting mistakes, compromising when they must, hitting some targets almost astonishingly well and missing others by a little. Once you allow for patient surveying with sighting rods, water-filled channels, and the slow accumulation of craft knowledge over generations, the impossibility begins to look like the upper edge of what a society like Old Kingdom Egypt could achieve, not proof of something magical. Finally, there is the question of time. Some alternative theories suggest the pyramids are far older than Orthodox Egyptology allows, relics of a pre-dynastic age or even of a civilization before the last ice age. Here again, context matters. The pyramids do not sit in a vacuum. They are woven into a whole fabric of Old Kingdom life. Around them are mastaba tombs for nobles, filled with wall scenes showing hairstyles, clothing, furniture, boats, animals, all in a style that fits neatly between the earlier art of the first dynasties and the later art of the Middle Kingdom. Inscribed names and titles in those tombs match records from quarry marks and administrative papyri. The same officials who oversee estates in texts are depicted supervising work or receiving offerings on stone walls. Seal impressions in the workers' town bear the names of kings we can place in order from other sources. Organic materials from these contexts, wooden boats, pieces of charcoal, fragments of reed, have been radiocarbon dated. The dates cluster where Egyptian king lists say they should, around the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE. Not every date is identical, radiocarbon never is. But the overall pattern supports, rather than undermines, the historical framework built from inscriptions. If the pyramids were actually many thousands of years older, we would expect a jarring mismatch. We would expect the style of carvings to break sharply with what comes before and after, or for the radiocarbon dates from associated settlements and graves to fall in two very different bands. Instead, everything around the pyramids, art, language, tools, burial customs, flows into them and out of them as part of the same evolving culture. None of this means that alternative ideas arise from bad faith. Often they spring from a sense of wonder, from the feeling that there must be more to the story than blocks and ramps. Sometimes they spring from distrust of authority, or from disappointment with dry, technical explanations. The task, then, is not to mock those impulses, but to weigh them gently against what we can actually touch and measure. The stones, the bones, the texts left by people who walked those causeways and carved those names. When we do that, the pyramids slide back into their own time, no less astonishing for being human. And once we let them be human, another kind of mystery opens up. Not who built them, but how much of their original meaning we can still recover after 4,500 years of sand and silence. So where does all of this leave us? If we step back from the debates, from the more dramatic possibilities and the tempting what-ifs, a fairly clear picture comes into focus. The pyramids of Giza look most like what they are surrounded by, the work of an organized, firmly Egyptian state, drawing on Egyptian resources, Egyptian craft traditions, and Egyptian religious ideas. They sit at the center of a web of royal power that we can still trace. Inscriptions name kings, officials, and work crews. Tombs nearby show overseers with titles that match those in papyri and on seals. The same hands that carved hieroglyphs in distant quarries carved them again on funerary stelae within sight of the pyramids themselves. The logistics too point inward, not outward. The stone comes from quarries we can map, some just beside the plateau, others across the river or further south. The workers seem to have been drawn from the royal corps, Egyptians mobilized by corvée labour, or employed full-time as skilled artisans and administrators. They lived in an organised town with bakeries, breweries, barracks like galleries, and more comfortable houses for higher status staff. They ate bread and beer and onions and meat. They left trash pits full of animal bones and broken pots, graffiti with their gang names, traces of healed injuries that suggest someone was tending to their wounds. None of this feels accidental or improvised. It feels like a state project, a central authority planning, taxing, feeding, housing, and directing thousands of people over decades, coordinating quarrying, transport, food production, and religious ritual into one long, steady effort. That broad outline is about as solid as anything from the ancient world can be. But when we lean closer, when we ask for details, the sharp edges blur. We still do not know in a fully satisfying way what the primary ramp or ramps look like for each pyramid. Scholars have proposed straight ramps, zigzagging ramps, wrapping spirals, internal ramps, ramps that shifted as the structure rose. Experiments show that many of these could have worked in principle. The problem is not that nothing could work, it is that several things could have worked, and the stones are mostly silent about which one was actually used. We have ranges for workforce size, not exact head counts. Estimates run from the low tens of thousands to perhaps 20 or 30,000 at peak season, with a smaller core of permanent specialists. The workers' town gives us a sense of scale, but not a census. Some labour would have been coming and going with the Nile flood and the agricultural calendar, leaving fewer traces on the plateau itself. Even the chain of decision-making is partly in shadow. We know the king's name. We know some of his high officials. We know that scribes tracked deliveries, rations and work teams. But how were design changes decided? Who chose the exact angle after Sneferu's experiments? How many times did surveyors re-measure the base before someone said, "Good enough"? Those conversations are lost. The papyri we have are like a few surviving pages from an enormous filing cabinet, and under the stone itself more mysteries wait. Modern scans have revealed density anomalies and hidden voids inside the Great Pyramid, spaces that might be relieving chambers, construction gaps or areas with some other purpose we do not yet understand. Remote sensing on the plateau suggests there are still buried structures beyond the currently excavated workers' town. Every new method of looking seems to hint that there is more to find. Over the last few decades, those new methods have been steadily sharpening our view. Excavations at Hayt el Ghurab, the main workers' settlement, have turned what was once an abstract idea of labour into something more personal. Sleeping platforms, bread moulds, fish bones, little clay seals stamped with crew names. The Wadi el-Jarf papyri, found in a harbour on the Red Sea coast, suddenly gave us the voice of an overseer, Mera, describing in matter-of-fact lines how his crews transported limestone from Tura to the pyramid of Khufu. It is not a grand cosmic text, it is a work log, but that very ordinariness anchors the whole project in the daily grind of moving stone, trip by trip. Muon tomography, ground-penetrating radar, satellite imagery, all of these are slowly peeling back layers of sand and stone without having to tear the monument apart. They offer hints of corridors, cavities, foundations, trackways. Sometimes they confirm earlier guesses. Sometimes they force us to rethink comfortable assumptions. So the picture is not fixed. It is a moving mosaic, one that becomes clearer and more complex at the same time. And yet, even as the technical questions narrow, the larger mystery seems to widen. Part of that is simple scale. A human brain drifting towards sleep does not easily hold 6.5 million tons of stone in one thought. It reaches instinctively for metaphors, for giants, for gods, for visitors from elsewhere. Monuments this large distort our sense of what normal people can do. Part of it is distance. The people who planned and built the pyramids lived in a world thick with meanings we only partly share. For them, aligning a tomb with the north, with certain stars, with the Nile, with the cycle of the sun, was not just engineering. It was theology, kingship, and cosmic order all braided together. We can translate the words, diagram the passages, list the offerings, but the feeling of it, the way it sat in the mind of a priest or a stonecutter, remains just beyond our fingertips. And part of it is that the pyramids have outlived almost every story told about them at the time. The cult temples that once thronged with priests are mostly gone. The causeways that saw processions now face highways and apartment blocks. The names of minor officials have flaked away from their tomb walls. The original polished casing has been stripped from most of the surface. What remain are those huge stepped masses rising out of their own debris. They are, in a strange way, both explained and unexplained. Explained enough that we can see them as the work of a particular society, in a particular phase of its history, using tools and techniques that make sense for that time. Unexplained enough that they still pull the imagination toward deep time, toward questions about why humans build on such a scale at all, and what, if anything, truly endures. As night settles over the plateau, those questions do not demand urgent answers. They can rest where they are, like unfinished lines in an old inscription, softened by sand and shadow. In the quiet, it is enough to know that real hands shaped those stones, that real lives unfolded in the streets and barracks below, and that somewhere beneath the modern city, beneath the drifting dust, traces of their work and their days are still waiting to be found. If you let your thoughts drift back over everything we've touched tonight, a pattern begins to settle into place. The pyramids do not really need lost continents, vanished super-civilizations, or distant visitors to explain them. The weight of the evidence, the quarries, the tools, the workers' town, the papyri, the graffiti, leans in a quieter direction. It points to organized Egyptian builders working under Egyptian officials, answering to Egyptian kings, within a religious and political system that was already centuries old when the first true pyramid rose. That doesn't mean we have every answer. It doesn't mean there is no room for debate or that all scholars agree on every detail. It simply means that, of all the stories we can tell about who actually built the Great Pyramids, the one that fits best is also the least exotic, a Bronze Age state, at its peak, focusing its resources on stone, on ritual, and on the afterlife of its rulers. You may find that satisfying. You may still feel a pull toward other possibilities. Maybe the logistics feel just a little too smooth. Maybe you wonder about those unexplored chambers, those unread layers beneath the sand. Maybe you think later societies drew on knowledge that has gone missing from the record. Or perhaps you lean firmly toward the archaeological consensus, and see the alternative theories as part of the pyramid's modern mythology, rather than their ancient reality. Wherever you land, your own sense of the story is part of the long afterlife of these monuments. So, as you lie there, letting your eyes grow heavy, you might ask yourself, which explanation feels most convincing to you? Is it the slow, patient labour of thousands of ordinary people, organised by a powerful court, a hybrid picture, where later generations misunderstood or embellished what they found? Or something more speculative, something that leaves more space for lost knowledge and forgotten techniques? If you'd like to share, I'd be curious to hear which theory you find most persuasive and why. When you have a moment, maybe tomorrow, maybe in some quiet stretch of the day, feel free to scroll down and leave a comment. Tell me how you imagine the builders. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there right now, as your night, or your morning or your afternoon folds itself around the sound of this story. Those little details have their own kind of archaeology, a scatter of times and places, a reminder that people all over the world still lie awake under their own skies, wondering about the same stones. If this slow walk through ancient Egypt has been keeping you company, it helps a lot if you like the video, leave a comment and subscribe to the channel. It's a simple way to say, yes, more of this, and it makes it easier for other people, other late-night listeners, other quiet minds to find their way here too. You don't need to do anything right now. You can let that thought drift to the back of your mind and pick it up whenever you're awake and rested. For the moment, the Giza plateau can go dark again. The crowds thin, the tour buses fade into memory, the last voices fall away until there is only wind and sand and stone cooling under the sky. The pyramids are still there, as they were long before you were born, as they will be long after all of us are gone. Their angles soften in the starlight. The edges that look so sharp in the sun blur in the dark. Whatever secrets remain inside them are in no hurry to leave. Somewhere below, in the buried streets of the workers' town, the ghosts of ovens and sleeping platforms and broken pots keep their silent watch. Above, the kings they served lie, sealed in their own carefully arranged spaces, wrapped in the beliefs of a world that ended thousands of years ago. And you are here for a moment, suspended between them, a modern listener, floating on the edge of sleep, being carried across that distance by language, by curiosity, by a thin thread of imagination. You don't have to solve anything tonight. You don't have to decide which theory is finally, definitively right. You can simply let the stones be stones, the questions be questions, and your thoughts ebb and flow like the Nile in flood. When sleep comes, let it come gently. Thank you for listening. Rest well, and good night.